I stood there, before 300 people, a piece of paper trembling in my hands like a leaf in the wind, when suddenly I tore it. It wasn't just any tear, you know. It was like I was ripping 42 years of my own life apart. The silence that fell over that church was so heavy, I could hear my own heart beating erratically. 300 pairs of eyes staring at me, some in shock, others in disbelief. And there, holding the pieces of my carefully prepared sermon, I said the words I never thought would leave my mouth. I don't know what I believe in anymore. Let me rewind a bit so you understand how a respected pastor with 42 years of ministry arrived at this moment. My name is Paul Richards, and for 4 decades I was what people called an unwavering man of faith. I founded 3 churches, baptized over 1,000 people, officiated thousands of weddings, and consoled families in their most difficult moments. I was known as Pastor Paul, the one who always had a word of hope, a sure prayer, a biblical answer for any dilemma. But that Sunday morning, October 15th, something inside me simply broke, and it all started 3 months earlier, with a man who showed up at my church carrying a small statue of the Virgin Mary. I remember that day perfectly. It was a rainy Thursday, and I was in my office preparing the week's sermon when my secretary knocked on the door. "Pastor, there's a gentleman here who wants to speak with you. He seems different." Different. That word echoed in my mind when I first saw Joseph. He was a simple man, about 60 years old, his hands calloused from hard work, and in his eyes a serenity I rarely saw. It wasn't the manufactured serenity of the performative religious people I knew so well, but something genuine, profound. "Pastor," he said in a slow voice, "I'm not from your denomination, but I need to talk to you." He took a small statue of Our Lady from his bag, the kind they sell in Catholic shops, nothing elaborate, just a hand-painted plaster figurine. "My daughter gave this to me before she died. She said I should find someone who needed it more than I did." At that moment, I should have politely refused. After all, I had been a Protestant pastor for decades, and statues were something that, well, weren't part of our theology. But there was something about that man, the way he held that small figure, that completely disarmed me. "Why do you think I need this?" I asked, more out of curiosity than conviction. Joseph smiled, and it was a smile that carried an ancient sadness, but also an inexplicable peace. "Because, Pastor, sometimes we need to tear everything down to find what truly matters." He left the statue on my desk, and left, just like that. I stood there, looking at that small figure, not understanding why my heart was racing. In the following days, I tried to ignore the presence of that statue in my office drawer. But it was there, like a silent question I couldn't answer. I began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. During services, when I preached about faith, love, and hope, I saw in the faces of the congregation a hunger that my words seemed unable to satisfy. It was as if we were all playing a role, following a script that had lost its original meaning. The first crack in my certainty came 2 weeks later, during a counseling session with Mary, a church member for over 20 years. She was crying uncontrollably in my office, talking about the depression that had consumed her for months. "Pastor," she sobbed, "I pray, I read the Bible, I come to all the services, but I feel an emptiness that won't go away. Did God abandon me?" I started giving the automatic answers I had given for decades. "Have faith, Mary. God has a purpose. Sometimes He tests us." But as I spoke, my eyes drifted to the drawer where the small statue was, and for the first time in 40 years of ministry, my own words sounded empty to me. There was a woman suffering genuinely, and I was offering ready-made formulas, textbook answers. That night, alone in the office, I opened the drawer and picked up the statue. It was so simple, so unpretentious. Why did it bother me so much? I grew up in the Protestant tradition, where we were taught that statues were idols, obstacles between us and God. But looking at that small figure, I didn't see idolatry. I saw something I couldn't name, a tenderness, a closeness, an invitation to the silence that my boisterous faith had lost long ago. I began to question things that were once absolute to me. During a pastor's meeting, when we discussed church growth strategies and methods to increase tithes, I found myself thinking, when did faith become a business? I looked at my colleagues, talking about conversion targets and financial campaigns, and I felt a growing nausea. They weren't bad people, they were sincere men like I had been for so long. But there was something fundamentally wrong with that approach, something that reduced the sacred to numbers and statistics. It was around this time that I started doing something I hadn't done in years, walking the city streets without haste, without a schedule, just observing. And it was on these walks that I began to see God differently. I saw him in the tired smile of the cleaning lady who cleaned the hospital at 5 in the morning. I saw him in the calloused hands of the bricklayer who stopped his work to help an elderly woman cross the street. I saw him in the silent embrace a mother gave her son who had just lost his job. And each time I returned home, I picked up that small statue and wondered why had I spent so much time fighting symbols instead of seeking what they represented. The plaster figure wasn't God, I knew that, but it pointed to something greater, to a dimension of the sacred that I had lost amidst structured sermons and rigid doctrines. The second crack came during a Sunday service. I was preaching about God's love when a child, the daughter of one of the church families, began to cry in her mother's arms. It was a desperate, inconsolable cry. The mother tried to soothe her, but without success. From the pulpit, I could see the despair in the woman's eyes, the shame of disrupting the service. I stopped mid-sermon and came down from the pulpit. I walked up to her and extended my arms. "May I?" The surprised mother handed me the child. I held that little girl in my arms, and she immediately calmed down. I didn't say a word. I didn't offer any pompous prayer. I just held her, walking slowly down the church aisle. The silence that fell was unlike any silence I had ever experienced. It was a living silence, charged with presence. In that moment, holding that child, I felt God's presence more than in decades of elaborate sermons. I returned to the pulpit, gave the child back to her mother, and looked at the congregation. 300 faces looked at me, but now there was something different in their eyes. It wasn't the usual respectful admiration, it was something deeper, more genuine. "You know," I began, completely improvising, "sometimes God isn't in our words. Sometimes he's in our arms, in our silence, in our presence." That week, I received more calls from church members than in months. People were telling me how that moment had touched something deep in their lives. But I knew it had been a coincidence, a moment of grace that had happened in spite of me, not because of me, and that scared me. If God could act so powerfully through a simple, spontaneous gesture, what did that say about all the elaborate structures I had built over the years? I began to study differently. Instead of seeking texts that confirmed my convictions, I began to read authors who challenged me. I discovered Christian mystics I had ignored for decades, people who had found God in silence, contemplation, and simplicity. I read about St. Francis of Assisi, about Teresa of Avila, about Thomas Merton, and I realized there was a dimension of the Christian faith that I had completely lost amidst the noise of denominations and theological disputes. That's when I decided to do something I had never done in 40 years of ministry. I visited a Catholic church, not to convert, not to debate, but simply to observe. I chose a small chapel in the city center, far from my known circle. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the place was almost empty. Just a few elderly people praying in silence, a few candles lit, and an atmosphere of peace that I no longer found in my own church. I sat in the back pew and just observed. There was a statue of the Virgin Mary on the altar, similar to the one Joseph had given me, and for the first time, instead of feeling theological discomfort, I felt curiosity. What did those people find there that I could no longer find in my tradition? It wasn't superstition, as I had been taught to believe. It was a different way of relating to the sacred, more intimate, more sensory, more human. I stayed there for 2 hours, and when I left, I carried more questions than answers. But they were good questions, questions that made me grow instead of letting me become complacent. That night, I picked up the small statue Joseph had given me again. It was no longer a strange object in my drawer. It was an invitation, a bridge, a reminder that God was bigger than my theological categories. If you're watching this and have been questioning your own faith, your own certainties, let me tell you, don't be afraid to ask questions. Subscribe to the channel to continue following stories like this, because I believe that all of us, at some point, need to tear down our certainties to find deeper truths. The following weeks were a period of inner turmoil I had never experienced. It was as if 40 years of theological construction were being questioned simultaneously. It wasn't doubt about God. On the contrary, I had never felt His presence so intensely. It was doubt about everything I had built in His name. The structures, the hierarchies, the divisions, the absolute certainties that left no room for mystery. During this period, I began to pay closer attention to the people in my church. I saw Joseph, a simple man who worked as a janitor, and who always arrived half an hour before services to pray in silence. There was something in his simplicity that deeply touched me. I saw Helen, a widow for 20 years, who spent her afternoons visiting the sick in hospitals, without fanfare, without expecting recognition. I saw young Robert, who had overcome drug addiction and now dedicated his nights to talking to other young people at risk. These people lived a faith that was more authentic than any sermon I had ever preached. They didn't have elaborate answers to life's mysteries, but they had something more precious. They had love in action. And I began to realize that for years, I had complicated something that could be much simpler. The third crack, the definitive one, came during a conversation with my own wife. Carmen had been worried about me for weeks. "Paul," she said one night, "you're different. Not bad different. It's more genuine different. But I'm afraid of what this means for us, for the church, for everything we've built together." I looked at this woman who had been my companion for 35 years, who had sacrificed her own dreams to support my ministry, who had raised our children while I traveled, preaching at conventions and conferences. "Carmen," I said, taking her hands, "what if everything we've built is on the wrong foundation? What if God is calling me to something different?" She was silent for a long time. Then she said something that moved me deeply. "Paul, for years I've been praying that you would find again the man who fell in love with Jesus when you were young. That 20-year-old who wanted to change the world, not with pretty words, but with true love. If this process is leading you back to Him, then I support you, no matter what it means." That night, I couldn't sleep. I took the small statue that had become my companion in reflection and went out to the backyard. The sky was starlit, and for the first time in years, I felt small before the immensity of the universe. "God," I prayed, "I don't know who I am anymore. I've spent 40 years telling people who you are, but now I realize that maybe I've never truly known you. Show me the way, even if it means tearing down everything I've built." The answer didn't come in the form of a voice or a vision. It came as a growing certainty that I needed to be honest with myself and with the people who trusted me. I could no longer preach certainties that I didn't feel. I could no longer offer ready answers to mysteries that I didn't understand myself. I needed to have the courage to be vulnerable, to admit my doubts, to invite people on a journey of seeking instead of offering guaranteed destinations. That's how I arrived at that Sunday, October 15th. I had prepared a sermon on the certainty of faith, based on Hebrews 11:1. It was a safe, familiar sermon that would please the congregation, but when I went up to the pulpit and looked at those familiar faces, I felt it would be a betrayal to preach those words. I began by reading the biblical text, as I always did. But when I got to the part where I should have developed the sermon, I stopped. The silence stretched for a few seconds that seemed eternal. I looked at the paper in my hand, then at the people in the church, then back at the paper. And that's when it happened. "You know," I began, completely deviating from the prepared sermon. I've been here for 40 years talking about the certainty of faith. But today I need to be honest with you. I felt my voice trembling. 3 months ago, a man brought me a small statue of the Virgin Mary. I should have rejected it, according to our tradition, but I didn't. And since then I've questioned everything I thought I knew about God. I could feel the tension rising in the church. Some members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked at me with concern, but I continued. During these weeks, I discovered that my faith had become a fortress full of certainties, but empty of mystery. It had become a set of ready answers, but without space for genuine questions. It had become a successful business, but not necessarily a genuine encounter with the sacred. It was at that moment that I picked up the prepared sermon and in front of everyone, began to tear it up. First once, then again, until the pieces fell to the floor of the pulpit. The silence was deafening. I don't know what I believe anymore, I said, and my voice echoed through the church. Or rather, I know who I believe in. I believe in Jesus. I believe in love. I believe in compassion. But I don't know if I believe in all the structures we've built in His name. I don't know if I believe we have a monopoly on the truth. I don't know if I believe God cares more about our doctrine than about our capacity to love. I looked at the people and saw a variety of reactions. Some were shocked, others confused, some even seemed relieved. You have every right to question my leadership, I continued. You have every right to seek another pastor, a more secure leadership. But if you stay, know that we will walk together, not as people who have all the answers, but as people who are genuinely seeking God. I stepped down from the pulpit and walked to the front pew, where Mary was sitting, the same woman who had cried in my office weeks before. Mary, I said, remember when you asked me if God had abandoned you? I don't have a theological answer to that, but I have a certainty: you are not alone. None of us are. And maybe that's what matters. What happened next was something I will never forget. Slowly, people began to stand up, not to leave the church in protest, as I had feared, but to approach me. Joseph, the janitor, was the first. He came to me and simply hugged me. Pastor, he whispered, thank you for being real. Then it was Helen, then Robert, then others. Of course, not everyone reacted that way. About a third of the congregation left that day, and I understand perfectly. They came seeking certainties, and I offered doubts. They came seeking answers, and I offered companionship in the search. But those who stayed, those who stayed, created a truer community than anything I had experienced in 4 decades of ministry. In the following weeks, our church transformed. The services became smaller, more intimate. There was more silence, more space for contemplation. People began to share their own doubts and questions without fear of judgment. We discovered that vulnerability, far from weakening our faith, actually strengthened it. Joseph reappeared 3 months later. He entered the church during a service and sat in the back pew, with the same serene smile he had when we first met. After the service, he approached me. Pastor, he said, my daughter would be happy to know that her figurine fulfilled its purpose. What purpose? I asked. To help you tear down what needed to be torn down so you could find what truly matters. It was only then that I understood Joseph hadn't appeared in my life by chance. He had been, in some mysterious way, an instrument of God to awaken me. The small figurine wasn't important in itself, but for what it represented. An invitation to step out of my theological comfort zone and rediscover the sacred in a deeper, more authentic way. 5 years after that Sunday, I continue to pastor, but in a completely different way. Our church is smaller numerically, but infinitely richer spiritually. We don't preach absolute certainties, but walk together in the search. We don't have all the answers, but we have compassion for the questions. We don't divide the world into us and them, but recognize that God works through people of all traditions and denominations. The small statue of the Virgin Mary is still on my desk, not as an object of veneration, but as a reminder that God is bigger than our divisions. It reminds me daily that sometimes we need to tear down our certainties to find deeper truths. It reminds me that true faith isn't the absence of doubt, but the courage to walk with it. Carmen remains by my side and says she's never seen me so at peace with myself. Our children, who had distanced themselves from the church because they found it hypocritical and superficial, have returned and brought their own children. They say they've finally found a faith that makes sense, a spirituality that doesn't need to be afraid of questions. If you've read this far, perhaps it's because you're also questioning some certainties in your own life. Let me tell you, don't be afraid to tear down what needs to be torn down. Don't be afraid to question, to doubt, to seek. God is big enough to handle our questions. In fact, I believe He celebrates them because they show that we are genuinely seeking, genuinely growing. Today I understand that moment in the pulpit when I tore up my sermon wasn't an act of rebellion or madness. It was an act of liberation. It was the moment I stopped trying to impress God with my eloquence and began to meet Him in my vulnerability. It was the moment I stopped being a professional of faith to become a seeker again. And you know what I discovered? God prefers sincere seekers to self-assured preachers. He prefers humble hearts to minds full of certainties. He prefers people who know how to cry to people who only know how to speak. He prefers mystery to explanation, compassion to correction, love to doctrine. That small plaster statue, so simple, so unassuming, was the instrument God used to teach me the greatest lesson of my life, that He doesn't fit into our theological boxes, isn't limited to our traditions, doesn't care about our divisions. He only wants our sincere hearts, our genuine seeking, our willingness to love. So if you're facing your own questions, your own crises of faith, know that you're not alone. Know that it's possible to tear down old certainties and still find God, or perhaps, precisely because of that, find Him in a truer and deeper way. The journey continues, and each day I bring new questions, but now they don't scare me. They invite me to a more intimate relationship with the sacred mystery we call God. And in that intimacy, in that vulnerability, in that constant seeking, I have found a peace that surpasses all understanding. May God bless you on your own journey, whatever it may be. And remember, sometimes you need to tear down to rebuild. You need to question to find. You need to doubt to truly believe. This is the paradoxical beauty of authentic faith.